Everybody, my name is Stephen Cohen. I work here at the Mirowitz Center, and on behalf of the Mirowitz Center, I'm delighted to welcome all of you here today for this presentation. The timing of the presentation couldn't be better. Some of you probably saw in the newspaper over the last week or so that there are efforts being made in Missouri, both at the state and the federal level, to recognize and celebrate Karl Lutz and his contribution to the rescue of people during the Second World War. So the timing for this presentation is absolutely perfect. And the person to present it is the ideal person, someone who has spent a great deal of time researching and studying his life. Amy Lutz, who is no direct relation to our hero of the presentation, is the manager of communications and social media for the St. Louis Kaplan Feldman Holocaust Museum. She holds a bachelor's degree in history from St. Louis University and a master's degree in history from the University of Missouri, St. Louis. And she is currently working on a book about the aviator Amelia Earhart, who was born in her hometown of Atchison, Kansas. Amy is also a classically trained pianist, and she currently lives in St. Louis with her dog Kyla, and we are delighted to have her here and to welcome her to our Mirowitz Center. Thank you so much, Amy.
Thank you for that. I'm very excited to be here. I'm always excited to give this presentation and talk about someone as amazing as Karl Lutz. I'm glad you mentioned the efforts to recognize him. I'm not going to talk about those quite yet, but there's some very exciting things happening definitely on the state and federal level that I'll get to at the end of the presentation. So let me share my screen here. I hope you're getting a view of the end. So some of you may know who Karl Lutz is. Some of you may be coming to this presentation not knowing anything about him. Regardless of where you are on that scale, I hope to tell you his whole story. It's a very important story. And I actually want to start at the beginning. So Karl Lutz was a Holocaust rescuer active in Budapest, Hungary from 1942 to 1945. But to really understand his actions, you have to actually understand who he was as a person and how his career led him to do what he ended up doing during the Holocaust. These are just some key points that I'm going to talk about today. I won't spend too much time on this timeline, but as you can probably see, and maybe as many of you know, Lutz did spend in total actually about a decade in the St. Louis metropolitan area. And so he has some fairly close ties to the area as well. Now, speaking of those close ties, Karl Lutz was born in 1895 in a very small town in Switzerland. And he grew up in a very large family, very devout family. His family was Methodist, and his mother, who's in that photo right in the middle there, when he was a young man, always instilled in him the belief that it was his responsibility to take care of people who were in need, people who were in jeopardy, people who were in trouble. And he certainly took that with him much later in life. Now, when he was about 18 in 1913, not knowing a word of English, he realized he wanted greater opportunities than he felt were given to him in his very small town. And so he actually came to another small town. He came to the United States and spent about 5 years in Granite City, Illinois, working in a factory, trying to make money so he could go to school. And then in about 1919, actually about late 1918, he enrolled in Central Wesleyan College. Now, some of you may have heard of that school, some of you may have not. It actually closed in 1941, I believe, so it certainly has not been around for quite a while. But it was a school primarily for German-speaking immigrants, and it used to be in Warrenton, Missouri. I'll have a photo of it here, a photo of what's left of it here on the next slide. I took this myself, if you can tell by the lack of photography skills here. It was a very bright day, but the Methodist church that was on campus at Central Wesleyan College is still there, and there's still a sign outside that says Central Wesleyan College, 1871. And so while Lutz was there, he actually was studying to go into ministry or missionary work. He wanted to be some sort of pastor, some sort of missionary, but he realized pretty quickly that he was not a great public speaker. He was a perfectionist. He never felt like he was doing good enough. And Lutz, personality-wise, this will become important later in his story, was not shy, but a bit soft-spoken. He was not the kind of person that intentionally drew a lot of attention to himself. And because he had terrible stage fright, he realized that preaching in front of large groups of people was not something that was going to happen. And so as you see on this slide, going back one a little bit, he actually transfers to George Washington University in 1924, or where he graduates from there in 1924, spends some time working in the diplomatic service in Washington, D.C., later in Philadelphia. He spends about 6 weeks in New York and completely hates it, and so he transfers elsewhere. And his final appointment was actually in downtown St. Louis. I'll touch on this a little bit. I apologize. I know some of this text is quite small, but I'll explain what you're seeing here. So as I mentioned, his last appointment as a diplomat was in downtown St. Louis in 1933 and 1934. This photo in the top right is another photo that I took myself. As you can tell, the stoplight was red, so I did not take this while I was driving. But this is the corner. This is 411 North 7th Street. It's the former site of the old Ambassador Building, if you're familiar with that. That was demoed, 25 years ago, something like that. But he worked in that building at the time, at least the building that used to be on this block. And he lived in the old Statler Hotel, which is now the Marriott Grand on Washington Avenue, which is basically just right around the corner. He actually met his wife here. His wife was another Swiss immigrant who also worked within that office complex where he worked. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch, as you'll see on the left here, posted their wedding announcement, or their engagement announcement, and later their wedding announcement. They actually went back to Switzerland to wed, but they lived here. And his future wife at the time actually lived at 3730 Lindell Boulevard. And if you're familiar with downtown at all, that's actually Queen's Daughters Hall, which is now on the campus of St. Louis University. And so that is where she lived. I know that you all cannot see this, but I have a close-up photo of it on the next page, and I want to explain to you what you're seeing here. And so while Lutz was in the United States, he was sending quite a large number of letters to his superiors back in Switzerland saying, hey, I want to come home. This American weather is hard on my health. Please let me come at least to Europe, if not back to Switzerland. And many of those requests were actually denied, even though he kept sending the letters. But finally, after he marries his wife, after he returns to Switzerland, he receives a new appointment in British Palestine. Of course, as we know, the state of Israel had not yet been officially founded. Palestine was under British mandate. And so that's where he is sent for his first diplomatic appointment outside of the United States. The St. Louis Star-Times, which is of course now defunct, printed this article. I'll go back to the page, the headline being Holy Land Adventure, Former St. Louisans in a Biblical Setting, and printed this whole page photo of this former St. Louis diplomat and his wife and their adventures in the Middle East. This was printed on May 20th, 1936. It says in here that they spent Christmas in Bethlehem and Easter in Jerusalem. And Lutz's time in British Palestine, which I'll explain here in a few minutes, I believe on the next slide, becomes very, very important in terms of what he does next. And there's this very interesting line at the end of this article that I'm sure the reporter who wrote this article had no way of knowing what they were saying, but it said, it's a big move from the Mississippi to the Jordan. In the consular service, one never knows where he may be sent next. And it has this interesting bit of foreshadowing once you know Lutz's entire story. So next, as I mentioned, he ends up in British Palestine from about 1936 to 1942. He does end up going back to Switzerland for a short time before he arrives at his next appointment. But he is there for a few years. And he does seem to enjoy the appointment for at least a few years. But then in 1939, I'll skip that first bullet point for now, but in 1939, the Second World War breaks out, as I'm sure we all know. And what happened was there were about 2,500 Germans in British Palestine at the time. And so when the war breaks out, they are basically de facto prisoners of war. This happened quite a bit during the World Wars. There were a number of Americans stuck in Japan after the United States enters the war. And what happens in those situations is that the warring nations will reach out to a neutral nation and neutral diplomats to negotiate the movement of the people in the warring nation back to their home nation. And so that's what happened here. Karl Lutz, as a Swiss neutral diplomat, was appointed this opportunity to negotiate the release of these German citizens in British Palestine in 1939. And apparently he does a really great job. He works 20-hour days for days and days on end, and is eventually able to secure the release of these 2,500 people, many of whom were diplomats, some were not, so that they could go back to Germany. Apparently he does so well at this job that he starts to get praise from his superiors, from his colleagues. That praise actually ends up reaching back to the Führer's office in Berlin. And the people working in that office begin to know him by name. It's just this kind of honorable, neutral diplomat who just did a very good job for these German citizens in Palestine. Couple things that also happened at the time. There were somewhere between a couple hundred and a couple thousand, numbers vary, of German Jews in British Palestine at the time, who, as you can imagine, did not want to go back to Germany at any point, especially after the war ended. And so at this point, Karl Lutz is introduced to these Schutzpasses, these protective papers that allow their holders exile in Palestine. And so he was able to give a number of these out to German Jews living in British Palestine at that time, so they would not have to go back to Germany, and therefore were relatively protected from what would eventually go on in Europe during the Second World War. Those papers will come back later, so do remember those for the next couple slides. And then finally, we're going chronologically backwards, but I think narrative-wise, it's important to kind of point out this last. One of the first things that happens when the Lutzes are in Palestine is that they see 4 Jewish men lynched in the street from the roof of their apartment. And the next day, Karl Lutz writes a letter to his brother in which he says, quote, "As I swore to the victims as they suffered hits and stabs that one day I would speak up for them." And there is a short-term and a long-term promise inherent in that statement. Short term, he did send a report to the British government describing the violence he had seen against Jews in the surrounding community. But there's a long-term promise inherent in that statement that will kind of flesh out as I go through the rest of this story. I gave this presentation to students who probably did not know where British Palestine was at the time. So that's why there's a map on here, if you're wondering where it was. But I'm sure most of us certainly know. So in very early 1942, he arrived about January 2nd, 1942. Karl Lutz is transferred to Budapest, Hungary in another diplomatic role. It was actually his responsibility to represent the interests of about a dozen warring nations, including the United States and including Great Britain at the time. And context-wise, as many of you probably know, Hungary was allied with the Nazis at this time in 1942 when Lutz arrives. And while there were a series of pieces of anti-Semitic legislation, so it was hardly a quote-unquote good place to be if you were Jewish at the time, relatively speaking to the rest of Europe, to say Poland, to Germany, to France, the conditions were much worse for Jews at the time in those other nations. Now that would soon change, but that's not the case in 1942. Now that changes on March 19th, 1944, when the Nazi Wehrmacht, the Nazi army, invades Hungary and immediately start implementing much of the legislation that they had implemented in other nations as well. Within about 2 months, actually we're nearing the anniversary today of when this happened. Within about 2 months, the deportations to Auschwitz begin, beginning in the rural areas of Hungary. But in the approximately 6 weeks between mid-May and early July 1944, 438,000 Hungarian Jews were sent to Auschwitz. About 90% of them were killed upon arrival in a very short period of time. Now, the deportations were stopped temporarily in July for a lot of complicated reasons that I can get into later if you'd like. But during those 6 weeks, there is this rapid movement of people to Auschwitz and elsewhere. And so Karl Lutz is still stationed in Budapest at the time, and he's seeing this happen and realizes he needs to act. One of the first things that he does is he basically takes the Jewish Council for Palestine, which is a non-governmental Zionist organization, and brings them under the umbrella of the Swiss legation in Budapest, changes their name to the Department of Immigration of the Swiss legation. And it's through that department that a lot of his rescue efforts actually end up being implemented. At the same time, he remembers that he had these protective papers, that he was introduced to these protective papers, the Schutz passes, when he was in Palestine. And what he realizes is that he might be able to use them to his advantage. Now, of course, no one in Budapest at this time is going to make their way to British Palestine. The borders are closed. There is a war ongoing. However, these sort of off-label usage of these papers is that anyone who held them was therefore under Swiss diplomatic protection. They often did not have to wear Jewish stars. They typically were not forced into ghettos. And most importantly, they were not deported. They were protected from some of the worst things happening to Hungarian Jews at the time. And so Karl Lutz has these papers. They're literally already printed by the British. He actually has to do some negotiating with his own colleagues and his own superiors to make sure that the Swiss government will semi-author them. I'll get to that later. But what he realizes is that since the German authorities, or the people in charge in Hungary at that time, he needs at least basic authorization of these papers from someone in German in the Nazi high command, because otherwise, if they don't honor those protective papers, then it's not going to matter. Those papers will not be able to protect anyone. And so Lutz asks around for a little while and is finally directed. He talks to Hitler's plenipotentiary in Hungary for a while, who directs him to someone else. He says, Mr. Lutz, who you should talk to? You should talk to this man who just arrived in Budapest by the name of Adolf Eichmann. So Lutz sets up a meeting with Eichmann, who we know a lot more about Eichmann now than Lutz would have at the time. But recall how I described Karl Lutz when he was in college. He was a pretty tall man. He was very well dressed, well spoken, but he was also soft-spoken. He also did not call a lot of attention to himself. And so when he walks in Adolf Eichmann's office, Eichmann is in no way intimidated by him, which ends up playing to his advantage. So Karl Lutz presents these papers. He's like, look, I have about 8,000 papers that have already been authorized. All you have to do is just say, okay. And he's sitting there negotiating. And Eichmann uses this as an opportunity to mock him. He said, who do you think you are? Are you Moses taking your people to the promised land? But Lutz was very adamant. He said, these are already authorized. These are under Swiss authority. There's no reason why you shouldn't authorize these. And Eichmann didn't want to make the decision, so he kicks it up to Himmler. And Himmler kicks it up to someone in the Führer's office. Now, we're unsure if Hitler himself actually saw this request, but Lutz gets a message few weeks later that says, basically, we remember this man. We remember this man from his work in Palestine. And because of that, we are authorizing these 8,000 papers. I'm going to talk more in depth actually about what those papers look like here in a second. But one of the questions I get a lot when I give this presentation is, if you're familiar with the Swedish rescuer Raoul Wallenberg, he's also active in Budapest at the time. And the question I get is, what was their relationship? So Wallenberg does not arrive until quite a bit later, actually about July 1944. And one of the first meetings he sets up is with Karl Lutz. Karl Lutz shows him how to produce these protective papers that he goes on to develop. Here's a modern day map that I showed to the students with Hungary in the middle there. Let's go to the next slide. So in terms of the protective papers, Karl Lutz never intended on only saving about 8,000 people. When he gets back to his office working with his staff and his volunteers, Zionist organizations, underground Jewish organizations, there were quite a number of people involved in this effort. He immediately alters the papers so that each one of them covered not an individual, but a family. And so as you can possibly imagine, the number of people he was able to protect goes up to 30, 40, 50,000 almost immediately. And so he puts out the word that he has these papers. You'll see the crowds of people with the Hungarian police officers trying to break them up on the right. Literally hundreds of Hungarian Jews, if not thousands, would show up outside of his office in Freedom Square every single day begging to get these papers. And he and his staff are desperately trying to get them out as quickly as possible. Now, I've kind of alluded to this already, but these papers were given out under the guise that the people who held them had some relationship with Switzerland, were Swiss nationals of some sort. Almost none of them were. These papers were kind of semi-forged, only semi-legal, but Lutz's idea was to save as many people as he possibly could, as quickly as he possibly could, because by mid-1944, late 1944, it's pretty clear that the Nazis are on their last leg, that the Red Army is coming almost around the corner, but that does not mean that the genocidal aims of the Nazis slowed down. And so Lutz is trying to get as many of these papers out as humanly possible. So in addition to the papers, which of course are the biggest chunk of his rescue efforts, he was active in a lot of other things, as was his wife. His wife would often bribe Hungarian soldiers or SS officers to look the other way, or to provide any sort of assistance, or not come into the international ghetto, which I'll talk about here in a second. So Lutz puts about 67 buildings under Swiss diplomatic protection, as does Raoul Wallenberg, as do the Portuguese, the Red Cross, and the Vatican as well. And together, the Swiss had the biggest chunk of those buildings, but together those protected buildings under diplomatic protection was called the, quote, international ghetto. And so Jews who had lost their property, their homes, had somewhere to go, and were therefore protected under the diplomatic protection of those 5 different nations or organizations. And so Karl Lutz's wife was very active in there, providing any resources that she could. There were also times where Karl Lutz stepped in to rescue individual people in the best way that he could. There's this one famous story where he and his driver are driving past the Danube. You'll see a photo of them there on the right. And one of the things that the Arrow Cross soldiers, the fascist political party in Hungary that staged a coup in October of 1944, one of the things that they would do is they would bring groups of Hungarian Jews down to the banks of the Danube and would basically stage firing squads and would push people into the river after they had been shot. If you've been to Budapest or have seen photos of it, you'll see the memorial with the shoes on the banks of the river. And so that's what those mean. And so after he and his driver were driving past one day, one of these incidents had just happened, and the Arrow Cross soldiers were still standing there. But Lutz looks in the water and he sees this woman bobbing up and down. She had been shot, but she was still alive, trying to get back to shore. And so Karl Lutz, probably wearing something very similar to what you see in that photo, jumps into the freezing cold water up about waist high and pulls this woman out, and immediately turns around to these shocked Arrow Cross soldiers and says, how dare you? What are you doing? This woman is under Swiss protection. And they're just so taken aback. They say, okay, fine. They thought this guy who they didn't know, maybe someone important. And so he packs her up in a car, takes her back to the international ghetto, and connects her with a surgeon there. As you may have been able to guess, Karl Lutz had never met this woman before. She was not actually under Swiss protection, at least not until he jumped in that river. But he saw an opportunity to save someone and he took it, even at the risk of his own life. Unfortunately, towards late 1944, Adolf Eichmann, the Nazis and their collaborators found out what Lutz had been doing, that they had basically been falsifying papers in order to protect people. And so Lutz and his wife were forced to participate in this horrible example of psychological torture that the Nazis were unfortunately very adept at. And they were brought to a brickyard, which served as a transit camp for where Jews were held before they were put on trains and sent to camps. And there was a group of Jews there who had Swiss protective passes. The problem was that many of them were forged. Now, Karl Lutz himself didn't have problems with forgeries. He actually knew that forgeries were going around. But what the Nazis forced Lutz and his wife to do at gunpoint is to look at each one of those papers and identify the valid papers and the forgeries. And while they tried to allow some of the more convincing forgeries through, they had to identify the false papers, because if they did not, then none of the papers would be authorized. And so in order to protect a majority of the papers, they were forced to identify people who held false ones, meaning those people were no longer protected. This was a horrible, horrible incident. They actually had to do it a couple times, and it haunts the Lutzes for the rest of their life. Very, very traumatizing. Nope, lost my page there. So the war's coming to a close. The siege of Budapest starts actually Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1944. And so Karl Lutz, because of his role, was required to protect the British embassy, which I believe that's where his office was. And I think he lived in the American embassy, but it might be the other way around. And so he and his wife, their staff, there was about 24 people in the end, actually take refuge in the basement of that embassy for about 2 months while the city is being bombed above their heads by the Red Army, by some Romanian soldiers as well, as the Nazis are slowly being forced out of Budapest. And so eventually, after those 2 months, they're freed from the basement. Nazis are pushed out. The Red Army liberates the city. Now, unfortunately, the Soviets believed that the neutral diplomats had been, for some reason, collaborating with the Nazis. Of course, they weren't. And so they immediately expel all of the neutral diplomats. Wallenberg is actually arrested and later dies at the hands of the Soviets. But the Lutzes are able to escape. And one of the first places they end up in after they escape on their way back to Switzerland is that they end up in Istanbul, they end up in Turkey. And the morning that they arrive, Karl Lutz orders a glass of orange juice, which sounds like a minor thing, but this will become important later. You know, he was in a basement for 2 months, so you can imagine there was not going to be any fresh fruit or vegetables or anything like that. So drinking a glass of orange juice was kind of a big deal. So he orders a glass of orange juice, and eventually they get back. They're on a ferry for a while, they're on a train for a while, making their way back to Switzerland. And as they're getting closer, Karl Lutz, who hated public speaking, wrote a series of remarks, just really detailing what he had done while he had been in Budapest. He assumed that at the very least, some of his colleagues might be there waiting for him or asking him, hey, what did you do? What during the war? What happened? So he's writing these remarks, expecting to have to say something. And so when he gets to the border with his wife and with, I believe, some of his staff arrive as well, the only thing any government official asks him is, do you have something to declare? Because he was a customs agent. It's a customs agent who literally asked that same question to everyone who came to the border because no one was waiting for him. No one was waiting for him when he arrived. In fact, none of his colleagues or superiors wanted to hear anything about anything that he had done while he was in Budapest. In fact, the only response that he receives about anything that had happened was he gets a note from the finance department shortly after he returned that said, hey, you were not authorized to buy this glass of orange juice when you were in Istanbul, and you need to pay us back. The finance department actually gave him and his wife a lot of trouble. They really dragged their feet on reimbursing the couple for their personal property that was damaged in the bombing. But eventually, Lutz, after just kind of asking around and figuring out what he was supposed to do, he eventually receives a note condemning him for what he had done. He was accused of, quote, going outside of his authority to rescue Jews during the Holocaust. Now, Switzerland actually basically buries this story for about 50 years. They don't acknowledge on a national level what he did until 1995, which was 20 years after he died. And so he actually dies thinking that he his reputation had been destroyed in Switzerland. I mean, he was seen as this troublemaker, and he spends the rest of his life trying to at least resolve that. Now, outside of Switzerland, he did receive quite a bit of recognition. Both he and his wife, Trudy, were declared righteous among the nations at Yad Vashem in 1963 and 1976, respectively. He received quite a bit of international praise, especially in Israel. He's very well beloved in Israel. He was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize 3 times during the 1960s, never winning. This is a little more recent, but as we mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, recently he was recognized because of this is a project I've been working on for quite a while, but luckily I was able to convince a couple representatives in the US House and a couple senators in the Senate to issue during the month of April 2 separate resolutions honoring Karl Lutz. And so he has received some recognition in the United States as well. That's not the only recognition, but it's the most recent. And so he did receive international recognition, but he died with his reputation being destroyed in his home nation. And he was very proud of being Swiss, and that was something that was very, very hard on him. But where I want to kind of wrap up here is In a 1949 report that he wrote after he got back, he wrote this 11-page report describing why he had done what he had done. And in it, he said, you know, Karl Lutz was a devout Christian in his case, and he believed that his faith was a big part of his decision-making. And he said, I did not want to be a Christian in name only. He felt that it was, quote, a matter of conscience to save people condemned to die. I'm sure many of you have heard from wonderful speakers who've talked about their own experience or others of the righteous among the nations. But if you look at how many of the righteous describe what they did, and Lutz among them, they'll say things like, well, I was just doing what anyone else would have done. I was just doing what a good person would have done, or what any normal human would have done. And certainly that was Lutz's motivation. He just thought, you know, he was doing what he was supposed to do, was to protect other people. But was, of course, very shocked that he was one of the few, sadly, who did that. So because of this motivation, because he undertook these actions in Budapest, Karl Lutz is recognized as overseeing the largest civilian rescue mission of the entire Holocaust. He rescued over 50,000 Jews during that time. Some people estimate between 50 and 70,000, meaning he rescued more people than any other individual. And of course, he was aided by his staff, his wife, and others as well. I'm actually coming to the end here, but if you would like any more information, actually, please do ask in Q&A. I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Sadly, one of the reasons why I speak a lot about this is because Karl Lutz really is relatively unknown. I mean, most students I ask when I say, hey, do you know who the person who saved the most people during the Holocaust is? And they have no idea. There's been basically one biography written about him called Dangerous Diplomacy. It was written in 1995, translated in 2000. There's a great kind of documentary that's app-based that if anyone wants to know, just email me and I'll tell you how to access that. And there's another book called Under Swiss Protection, Jewish Eyewitness Accounts from Wartime Budapest, written by Agnes Hershey, his stepdaughter, and Charlotte Chalier, who we were lucky to have come speak at the museum in late February. So there are some places you can follow up. You can also email me, or at this time, I would be happy to take questions. So I'll stop sharing and we'll move on to that.
So we have one from Shulamit. Compared to Schindler, for example, I'm not sure what you would like to.
You were saying how many that he had rescued or known to have rescued more than anyone else. And I just was curious because I wasn't paying attention to Schindler, and I figured you would know. And good taste in water bottles.
Yeah, I was going to say, nice water bottle. So I don't know the exact number. Schindler rescued over 1,000 people. It's somewhere, it's 4 digits, somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000, which is still incredibly heroic, but he's usually one of the most known because of the movie.
Well, but proportional. Yeah, thanks. That's amazing.
Mm-hmm. Other questions?
You had so much
Thank you.
You're welcome. It's a lot of information, I know, and I talk fast, so sometimes it takes a while to. Oh, what's the email address? Let me put it in the chat, and you're welcome to.
And I will send it out to everyone after the program is over so that they can contact you if they think of something at a later date.
Absolutely.
Amy,
yes.
Has his reputation been restored in Switzerland?
Yes, so that's actually very interesting. Many of you probably know the big scandal that came out in 1995 about Switzerland holding property from the Nazis that had been stolen from Jews. And so suddenly in the mid-90s, Switzerland was not looking too great when it comes into their relationship with the Holocaust. And so suddenly, coincidentally, that's when you start seeing Switzerland really talk about Karl Lutz's record as, hey, this guy was one of us. He did all these brave things. And so by this time, yes, his reputation, I would like to say, has been restored. A lot of that is because of the work of his stepdaughter, who's literally traveled the world sharing his story. But, you know, it's sad because he died in 1975. His first wife died in 1995. Both passed away before they were really recognized in Switzerland.
Do we have some more questions?
I see one in the chat. Why do you think Lutz was passed up for a Nobel Peace Prize? I don't know. I wish I had a question. I did go back, gosh, probably a couple of years ago and look to see who was nominated that year. And as you can probably expect, the type of people who are nominated for Nobel Peace Prizes are all very, very deserving. And so it just happened to go to someone else those years. And also, if you think about it, in the early 1960s, neither he nor his wife had been declared righteous among the nations yet, and were relatively unknown still at that period of time.
Amy, you talk about his wife. I'm assuming from what you just said that that's his first wife?
Correct. Yeah, I usually forget to clarify that. So
and at which point did their marriage dissolve and he remarried, or was that the end of the war?
Yeah, so their marriage ended within a few years after the war. They remained amicable. Actually, she spends the rest of her life not only doing humanitarian work, but actually sharing their story worldwide. And then he gets remarried, I think the late 1940s or so, to another woman, and his stepdaughter is still living in Switzerland, and she's the one sharing his story. Other questions?
I think that's so much information, it's hard to process. So you might get some other questions after, everybody, absorbs the information, and you can have an email. Susan?
I actually have another question. What would be, because there was so much information about him and he did so many incredible things, what is the one takeaway that you would like us to remember about Karl Lutz?
That's a huge question. So boiling it down to one is tricky, but I'll try to be concise with this. So as I've been researching Karl Lutz's story for many, many years now, and what I'm hoping is that this will prompt similar questions in all of you after you've heard this story, is I constantly ask myself, what would I have done? What would I have done in that position? And when you hear about someone like Karl Lutz, who not only did these incredible brave things and rescued people, but stood up against his own colleagues, stood up against his own government to do the right thing, that's very intimidating. And so I really do hope that some of this starts a bit of self-reflection. And I don't have an answer to this question, but I ask myself a lot, what is it about people like Karl Lutz that makes them do what they do? And so I do hope that we can all look at his example and consider how we can implement some of those lessons in our own lives. I saw a couple hands raised, I think.
Yeah. Harvey, were you getting ready to say something?
Well, my question was a general question about the position of Switzerland during the Second World War. On the one hand, they thought they were neutral. On the other hand, there's evidence that they showed hostility towards admitting refugees. I know they refused to pay life insurance claims submitted by relatives of Holocaust victims, where Swiss life insurance companies were the insurers. So you get many mixed messages about Switzerland's position. Can you help us out a little bit?
The answer is it's complicated. It's very complicated. I mean, I will say this, Switzerland certainly provided refuge for people who were escaping oppression. So there at least are some things on the plus side as well. But the way that I look at it, and I've got a couple examples, but the way that I look at it is it's in their case, the role of a neutral nation is very important. As we talked about, the role of neutral diplomats are very important in war times like this. But in times where the stakes are so high, when it comes to having the Nazis do what they did, perpetrate the Holocaust, remaining neutral sometimes gets you into trouble. And I'm certainly not advocating they should have not been neutral, but you see the cases where they were actively trying to, some of Lutz's superiors were actively trying to stop him or outright punish him for what he did, because stepping out and rescuing people was considered a violation of Swiss neutrality. There's also the case that many of you are probably very familiar with early on in the 1930s. German Jews were forced to have a red J on their passport to identify them as Jews. That was not a German decision. It was actually a request from Switzerland. Switzerland was getting lots of refugees and wanted to identify the Jews coming into their nation so that they could limit Jewish immigration. And so they actually requested Germany add a red J on Jewish passports. And so it's very complicated. It's hard to say Switzerland was good, bad, that, you know, to use huge labels. But while there is value to neutrality, Switzerland is certainly not blameless when it comes back to their role in the Second World War, is what I think I can say.
Harvey Gerstein?
Why did, in your opinion, did they allow, when the Germans captured him, allow Karl to live?
You know, from what I can tell, a big portion of it is that they did not want to deal with the international incident of killing a neutral diplomat, of a Swiss diplomat. A lot of Nazi leaders at the time, you know, believing that they were entering into, you know, the 1,000-year Reich and all of that, wanted to make sure that they, as a new nation, would get respect from other nations, including neutral nations. And so I think that there was a lot of fear about just outright killing neutral diplomats. I will say that there certainly were times where he was in very compromising situations, where he tried, there was one case where he actively was trying to help someone, and he was put at gunpoint by some German soldiers. And so he did get very lucky, but I think a lot of it was just fears about the public perception of killing a neutral diplomat.
Yes. Steve?
Yeah, Amy, I want to thank you for a very beautiful story here. And I was wondering, this seems to me that it would make a great movie. Has anybody considered?
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question. So it also deserves an English language biography, which is, you know, next on my list. But there is a film called Walking with the Enemy that is based on a true story. It's about a young Jewish man who dresses up in a Nazi uniform in Budapest, Hungary, and uses that uniform to actually save people. He poses as a German and then would send Air Cross soldiers away. And Karl Lutz is a character in that movie. I believe that the actor who plays him does a very good job. There are some really important scenes. There's a great scene of him trying to help Jews on trucks heading to the international ghetto or heading to safety. And these Nazi soldiers arrive and have him actually look at the paperwork and identify which ones were real and which ones weren't. And you can see the pain on his face. So the actor who plays him is good. There are lots of issues with the movie though. Ben Kingsley plays Miklos Horthy, the prime minister of Hungary at the time, who was eventually ousted. And the movie presents him as almost a bit of a rescuer, which is a little complicated. So in the scene when there's actually the scene where Lutz talks to Eichmann is in the movie, and Ben Kingsley is standing there. So there's a lot of historical issues with it, although the man who played Lutz did a good job. So yes, there should be an entire movie about him, and I hope that there will be someday.
I also missed the very first part. Are you related? Because you have the exact same name.
Not that I'm aware of currently. So there is a branch of my dad's family that is Swiss. I'm primarily German. My ancestors, great-great-grandparents came over shortly after the Civil War. But there is one of the branches of their family is from Switzerland. However, I first found out about this story about, at least 15 years ago, because there was a photo of him, strangely enough, in a history textbook that my sister had. And so obviously the name stuck out to me. And then my dad looked at the picture and he said, he looks just like my dad. And so that kind of started the process. But in the research process, I've not found a direct connection now.
Have you done 23andMe?
My brother has actually, but that was years and years ago. I've thought about it.
Might trace it back.
We'll see what happens.
And Amy, I too missed the introduction about you. Like, where do you live? And also, could someone in Kansas City get this program that we saw? Could they get this whole thing? My brother's a professor of Holocaust studies and different things in Kansas City, and I thought he would love it.
Absolutely wonderful. So I'm sure the Mirowitz staff could answer this, but I'll try to answer and you can
Sure.
jump in. But So I'm the manager of communications and social media at the St. Louis Kaplan Feldman Holocaust Museum. So I'm right in the area. I'm actually in my apartment right now. So I'm not in the office.
Here in St. Louis.
Right here in St. Louis. So I'm very close. And yes, I mean, I know this presentation will be recorded and can be sent out. I also give this presentation a lot. I actually just gave this presentation to the Johnson County Parks and Rec Department in Kansas City. And so absolutely.
Yeah, I was thinking it'd be also great if you there, but either.
Well, we can certainly share, you know, Lois, we can, it is recorded and it will be shared out on our Mirowitz Center website. And you could share that link with your brother. And if he would like to make additional contact with Amy, I'm sure that would be fine.
I'm sorry. So how do you do the link?
I will send it to your email. How's that?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Perfect.
Great. I tell you, this Holocaust, this Mirowitz group is something else. They're wonderful.
Harvey, do you have another question?
Yes, I have another question. Before Carl Lutz was assigned to what was then Palestine, had he had any connections with members of the Jewish community or any connections with Jewish personalities of any kind?
That's a great question. So I'm sure he did. You know, I mean, it would hard to be say no, but the impression that we get for the few of us who have studied this is that just by the nature of his work and the people he surrounded himself with, he primarily was just around other Christians and other people who shared his faith most of his life, especially since he was kind of not a shy, but introverted person. And so he wasn't going to actively seek out other groups. However, the reason why I share that quote from that letter that he sent to his brother is that appears to be a real turning point in his life, that letter that he sent, where he actually actively sees the violence and then really has and decides to make a proactive stand to help Jews in danger at that point. Other questions?
I think we're winding down. Does anyone else have more questions? Stephen, did you have something? Harvey, did you have something? Stephen, did you want to say a few words?
I do. I think.
Wait, you're on mute, Stephen. Stephen, you're on mute.
There I apologize for that. I wanted to thank everyone for joining us today, and I hope that you'll share with the people who haven't been able to join us how much wonderful information we were able to get from Amy. This has been a real treat, Amy, and I want to thank you on behalf of all of us for your research, for your work at the museum, and for making time to be with us all. So thank you on behalf of us all, and all the very best in all that you're going to do to make his name better known around the community and in the country.
Well, thank you. And thanks for having me. You guys are a great group. I enjoyed it.
We'll see your name we'll see your name on the movie credits, right?
Let's hope so.
Yes.
Fingers crossed.
And we'll have tryouts for parts right here in St. Louis.
There we go.
Yes.
Maybe we can get Spielberg to take this one on too.
Yes, really. That's good. Call him up.
I'll give him a call today.
Bye, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.